Welcome back, folks. Today we are going over our Dynasty updated wide receiver rankings. If you haven't already seen the tight ends, running backs, and quarterback video that is here on this channel, go ahead and hop on over and show those videos some love. We are breaking down the wide receiver rankings, as I mentioned today. If you are looking for a very easy, readable way to view all of these rankings, position by position, as well as get an extra set of two other Dynasty rankings from both of my moderators on the Discord who are very knowledgeable Dynasty fantasy players as well, go ahead and click the link in the description of this video here. Join the free Discord. You can post your trades in the Dynasty Trade Center, talk all our strategy with us all offseason as we gear up for another fateful rookie draft ahead. As you can see here, I am wearing my throwback Jackson Smith-Njigba Seahawks jersey in honor of the man who is taking over the Dynasty wide receiver 1 spot in my rankings, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And guys, while a lot of folks out there can peddle all these stats at you and read off points per game numbers, I'm not going to do that. I'd kind of like to set myself apart here and talk more strategically about why I have these guys ranked where they are, whether that's landing spots, supporting cast, contract insulation, understanding where they're valued on the open Dynasty market. I play in over 20 different Dynasty leagues and really have a good feeling of where these guys should be valued and how they're traded based off of all the different examples I witness on a season-by-season basis. That's what I really want to bring to the table for you guys here. Real life experience rather simply than saying this guy had this many points per game this week. That all being said, Jackson Smith-Njigba has given you double-digit finishes on every single week this NFL season. He is the current wide receiver 1 overall in a PPR scoring format. And if he averages 134 yards in the final 3 remaining games of the NFL season, he is on track to beat Megatron's record for all-time receiving yards in a season. Regardless, this man is worth multiple first-round picks. I would say no less than 3 at this point in Dynasty Fantasy Football. And the only reason I'd even be considering doing a tier down from this player would be if I was getting a guy potentially like Garrett Wilson, who's kicking off our tier 2 here, and 2 extra first-round picks on top. That is how high JSN should be valued in your leagues. The next spot, as you can see here, I have Jamar Chase, self-explanatory, wide receiver 1 from the year previous. Still has a ton of upside here in Cincinnati. Obviously, the Joe Burrow comments recently have given some people some pause. I am not as worried about those things. I figured that that was a pretty generic statement to make as a quarterback. He wants to have fun playing the game. That's nothing new. He just signed a mega deal, and the fact of the matter with Jamar Chase is if he's healthy and Burrow's healthy, I would say you are locked for over 300 fantasy points. However, the key word there is Joe Burrow staying healthy. And that has been a serious concern for the Cincinnati Bengals team as he is entering Christian McCaffrey territory. As every single year you can damn near flip a coin and decide if Joe Burrow is going to be available for you. That is why he has been actually falling down my Dynasty rankings. I do think that one of your greatest strengths is availability and consistency. That is a big reason why I draft teams the way I do. If you just watched me do a season in review last night of one of my teams that came out of a startup this year, you would see that the number 1 stashed player that I had across all my 7 startups this last offseason was Amon-Ra St. Brown, as you can see in the 3 slot. The reason I have him here is he is consistency incarnate. And when you are building a Dynasty Fantasy Football team, you want someone that's going to show up for you each and every week, someone that is not incredibly injury prone, someone that is not entirely situation dependent, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is simply put that guy. He has been the wide receiver 3 in the last 2 seasons, was wide receiver 7 in the season before that, and guess where he's ranked today? Wide receiver 3. That's looking like 3 wide receiver 3 finishes in a row. Simply for that reason alone, that is why I have him above Puka Nacua. I know what I'm getting no matter what when I draft Amon-Ra St. Brown. And still being young with a ton of upside on a high-powered Detroit team, the sky is the limit for him to continue this for the next several years. As we mentioned next, I have Puka Nacua here, a guy who is unavoidably incredible on the field. He is a dominant force, even with Devontae Adams as wide receiver 6 this season, right next to him on the same offense. He is giving you top 5 production. He is absolutely incredible after the catch, as we witness on a weekly basis. And this man is just simply put a dominant force for this Rams offense linked with Matthew Stafford. I think he has to be at the number 4 spot. The only reason I don't have him higher is simply because of some of the off-field behavior recently. I know some of these things might seem trivial to most, and they don't really follow all of them entirely, but he was recently on stream on a short week where he has to go to Seattle in prime time for a potential division-winning game, and he was messing around with some streamers online. Just not really a good look for somebody, personally, that I think should be very focused on the current state of the team and contending window that the Rams are in. I like my fantasy football players to be, very focused, real life football players. And that's not an overall knock to Puka and his focus and his ability. But a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba that keeps his head down and is completely focused on the team, has shown zero diva qualities, and is very open about the fact that he is only in it for the team to win, just has me put him, quite frankly, an entire step above where Puka Nacua is at today. The next guy we got on this list is CeeDee Lamb, a guy who I know a lot of people had as their favorite to be the wide receiver 1 this season. Now, the George Pickens explosion mixed with the injury has obviously foiled some of those plans. However, I still think he does deserve to be right below Puka here at the 5 spot. Now, this guy, entering his 27 offseason here, is starting to get a tiny bit older, but let's not overreact, guys. These wide receivers can stay well dominant into their 31, 32 seasons, as we've now witnessed with Devontae Adams. I do believe CeeDee Lamb is still going to give you 3 to 5 solid years ahead of you. And from a dynasty perspective, if you are looking more than 3 years ahead, I simply think you're mistaken. I think you should treat Dynasty a lot more like redraft in a 3-year window. Your picks replenish every year. You always have a chance to continue to print liquidity and grow. Off-season retools are a very real thing, and you'll be watching several examples of me pull off a lot of off-season retools this season as I transparently show you some of the teams that I am working through and the strategy behind how I'm going to turn them around. At the 6th spot here, we have Justin Jefferson, who's taken a massive value hit with J.J. McCarthy this year, as we have not seen the best out of 9. It's been a little bit better in recent weeks, but honestly, I have never been a believer in J.J. McCarthy fully, and I do think Justin Jefferson is struggling immensely because of that. Now, I would hope he has a bounce back here, seeing that he is still one of the elite, if not the best separators in all of football, watching his routes, and I would expect a bounce back from him. However, I can't in good conscience have him any higher than this right now. Followed by Justin Jefferson is Malik Nabers, a young prospect, extremely young, coming off his first major knee injury here with the ACL tear, which is absolutely a bummer. But getting a guy like Jackson Dart and Cam Scadaboo to rework this New York offense, bringing in a new coach this offseason, I do still think that Malik Nabers' ceiling is immaculately high for the future. He is a fantastic dynasty building block and cornerstone asset to construct your rosters around. If you are a retooler or a ultimate rebuilder, he might as well be at the top of your buy sheet for the offseason to really get a solid piece in there that you feel can lock down your roster for the next several years. After that, I have Drake London here. And Drake London has shown incredible flashes at times. Obviously, the Michael Penix injury and the inconsistency in that quarterback room, now having Kirk Cousins come back into the fold, has limited his upside this season, mixed with a flurry of injuries he has also been playing through and sustained this season. Now, all that being said, at only age 24 years old and still being the ultimate alpha on that team, a guy whose catch radius is completely and utterly unguardable for most corners in the NFL. I think Drake London's ceiling is still a top 5 wide receiver for several years to come, and I would be taking him still in this tier 1 range. The final guy I have in this tier is Rashee Rice, who has been giving you incredible production by points per game metrics since he came back from the suspension. He was leading the league up until the Patrick Mahomes injury. And that obviously is going to affect his immediate production here, even starting into the beginning of next season. But we're almost finding Rashee Rice in a similar situation. He might take a little bit of a value dip this offseason because of the Mahomes injury, similar to he did from the suspension last offseason. You might have a buy window on him here at only age 25 still. His upside is fantastic, and he is a PPR yards after the catch monster. So his skill set is very translatable to be sustainable for the future. He's not as reliant on those deep, over-the-top, game-breaking balls, and I do prefer drafting players like that. The next example of that is kicking off Tier 2 with Garrett Wilson. I do want to add a small aside in here and just talk more about my Dynasty strategy, as even doing these videos, guys, I'm really not a big tiers guy. These are loose tiers and basically just more of a visual aid for you. Now, of course, do I have Garrett Wilson and Rashee Rice in a slight tier break? Yes, that's why I have them there. However, I don't think tiers matter as much in Dynasty as a lot of people think. Depending on the state of your team, your roster, the amount of liquidity that you have, and the ability to retool based off of market spikes in player values or different landing spots, trades in real life, whoever lands there in the rookie draft. All these things will massively fluctuate some of these players. And so that's why, although these quote unquote tiers exist, they're more loose structure. I more take these individual players on a very specific level of their potential output for the future and their current consistent production. I am a guy that really relies on consistency when I build a Dynasty roster. I look for repeatable finishes. I normally, very rarely, go for the boom bust guys, go for the big stretch guys. And when I'm talking about stuff like that, I'm talking about players like Jameson Williams, who, yes, of course, are great downfield threats and can give you 27 points on any given week and 6 points on the next. And while they still might have the chance to finish wide receiver 15 overall, I'm far more concerned in guys that can stack up consistent finishes and consistency across seasons, regardless of who their quarterbacks are, offensive coordinators, scheme changes, supporting cast. All that really comes into play when I'm making Dynasty decisions. Diving back into Tier 2 here, we've got Garrett Wilson next, a guy who just signed a mega deal with the New York Jets this offseason. When we talk about contract insulation, he is a perfect example of it. Hyper-efficient target earner, averaging well over 150 targets every single season, regardless of the revolving door that has struck him throughout his career in that New York Jets locker room. A completely destroyed franchise in disarray, unfortunately. However, you would hope that they're able to sort some of their quarterback issues this offseason, start to build the trenches out a bit so that they have a sustained path forward for further offensive output and better, more consistent production out of Garrett Wilson that we've yet to see so far. Only being 25 years old, though, his play style, especially as an elite separator and route runner, really does carve him out a super, super encouraging role for the future. Next guy will be Tetairoa McMillan. And I know a lot of people would have him lower than I do, but I personally have loved what I've seen out of Tet in his rookie season here. He has proven that he has the ability to high point catches, be a consistent physical threat downfield, has fantastic catch radius, and very good ball awareness. Now, I would like to see more understanding and, ability to find soft spots in the zone from Tet moving forward. I'm sure that'll partly grow with his chemistry with Bryce Young as the play breaks down and we see more developing downfield. All that being considered, I do believe Tet's ceiling is to move to that wide receiver 1 tier that we have here within the coming years, and being simply a rookie in a Carolina Panthers system that is still figuring it out while Bryce Young is still figuring it out. I think that Tet's ceiling is massively high. The next guy we have is Nico Collins. At one point during the season, he had plummeted down the rankings a bit. Now he is right back up. I think CJ Stroud has taken a lovely step forward this season, struggling in the early part of the year, but now having a fantastic second half of the season, fighting for a playoff spot with these Houston Texans behind still a very subpar offensive line, and having a lack of true weapons, in my opinion. I mean, you have Dalton Schultz there who's quietly putting up a tight end 9 finish this year and has been a decent outlet, but obviously the run game has been less than less than impressive. Although Woody Marks has probably given you a decent output here from a fantasy perspective, they still lack the ability to truly dominate a game on the ground and open the ball up on play action for CJ Stroud the way that I would imagine the Texans hope in the future. Not to mention that offensive line still needs help. Jaden Higgins, I do expect to have a very, very big second season breakout here, which we'll talk about down the line of this video here. However, Nico Collins has been getting it done for you in recent weeks, and I do expect him to continue this run forward. And when we talk about consistency, he is now the only Texans wide receiver in history to have 3 continuous 1,000-yard seasons in a row, regardless of the injuries and stuff that he has sustained. I still like Nico Collins here entering his 27th season. The next guy I have on this list is probably higher than I think most people have him, based off of the massive disappointment of this season, Brian Thomas Jr. Now, the interesting thing with Brian Thomas Jr. is the deeper metrics and analytics would tell you that he's actually still getting consistent target volume. He's still actually creating decent separation. It has just not clicked for this Jacksonville Jaguars offense this year with him, whether it's been the on and off field performances with the injuries that he has sustained, whether it has been Trevor Lawrence and his chemistry, whether it was him being nervous about taking those hits over the middle and having a little bit of shaky hands in the first 3 weeks like we witnessed from his performance. Regardless, this is a guy that broke the top 10 in his rookie season, looked incredibly dominant downfield, and I still believe at only age 23 years old has an incredible decade ahead of him with this Jacksonville team that is clearly ascending, fighting for a playoff spot, is looking to get double-digit wins, which I think they're going to hit this season, and will continue to develop with Trevor Lawrence, who is actually playing some really great ball in the last few weeks. Another quarterback that I know people are down on, but I still think a former number 1 overall pick that can continue to increase in value. The next guy I have here is Emeka Egbuka. Started extremely hot, but was a clear candidate for touchdown regression, as even in the early weeks here, and I was saying throughout the early parts of the season on some of my live streams across platforms, this is a guy that was being a little too lucky in the end zone, getting only 4 targets on the week, but having 2 of the receptions come in the end zone, inflating his numbers up to 20-point finishes. Now, all that being said, even by the eye test and what we've seen, Egbuka is fantastically talented. He is a great weapon to have on this Tampa Bay offense. He can run routes from any position on the field, on the outside, in the slot. Baker trusts him. He creates separation. He has good hands. This is a guy that Mike Evans continuously raves about as having all the talent in the world to grow to be a true alpha wide receiver 1 in Tampa over the coming seasons. And I think this rookie season was a nice flash of what you could be getting out of Egbuka as he continues to grow in his NFL career. So for that reason, I do have him right here beneath Brian Thomas Jr. The next guy on this list is George Pickens. And to be quite frank with you guys, I did debate having Chris Olave above George Pickens simply for the reason I was talking about before. Chris Olave has had very little explosive performances this year, actually has the least amount of 25-point or more finishes for being a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football this year. However, the reason he's found himself there is consistency. He's giving you a floor of 14 points per week and is absolutely getting the job done in a very, very inefficient Saints offense, where they've been changing quarterbacks this year between Spencer Rattler and Tyler Shook. We don't know the future of this franchise. The trenches are less than ideal as far as pass protection goes, in the ability to allow plays to develop downfield more, and a extreme lack of a consistent run game has not been able to open up the passing game in the way that obviously these coordinators are intending. All that being considered, there was concussion concerns. We haven't seen any of that this year. And Chris Olave being one of the consistent Ohio State products that comes out and continuously delivers for you, I think still should be very high on this list. Now, all to say, the only reason I have George Pickens ranked 1 spot ahead of him is, yes, he's 1 year younger, but it's really less to do with the age and more to do with the athletic profile that George Pickens has as a downfield threat, as a contested catch threat, and as a yak ability player. I think that regardless of if he stays in Dallas or not, which I actually don't expect him to this year, I think that the Dallas Cowboys have been proven in previous seasons to be quite cheap when looking at their cap situation and understanding that they are going to have to give George Pickens at least a DK Metcalf deal, which is what, 5 years, 30 mil a year, 150 million total, while they still have to, potentially bring back guys like Javonte Williams and attack that defense a bit more after losing Micah Parsons here. I think there's a lot of needs on that team. I could be wrong here, but I don't expect George Pickens to land back in Dallas. That being considered, there is a little bit of risk that is baked into his profile here. Regardless, the upside is still massive for George Pickens. As we already talked about Chris Olave here, the next guy I have on my list is A.J. Brown. Shown some diva behavior again this year, which I do not like out of my wide receivers, but in the second half of the season has been giving you consistent production, averaging more than 10 targets a game in the last 3 weeks, and has been giving you 100-yard games here. All that being considered, I do think his time in Philadelphia is up, and I would be expecting the Eagles to move off of him this offseason. He clearly wants to go somewhere where he is going to be hyper-targeted and utilized more in the offense. That being the case, I do have him still here in this tier 2, even though there's been a drop in performance in the last 2 years, but that is simply because I expect a different landing spot next year and an off-season value spike for A.J. Brown. And again, let's talk more dynasty strategy here. Some of these guys I like to hold specifically based off of what I think is going to happen to them in the market. When I talk about a value spike in the offseason, the narrative around A.J. Brown, if he gets out of this Eagles offense, will immediately vault him back up a few spots in these rankings, simply because people will then again be willing to pay for A.J. Brown. I think right now you'll be hard-pressed to get more than a late first-round pick for A.J. Brown. But if he gets traded, guys, and let's just say he ends up in a good landing spot, the narrative around A.J. Brown is going to change entirely from Philly can't run the ball, Devonta Smith is splitting touches there, their offensive coordinator sucks, all to like, this guy has the opportunity at age 29 to still have 2 to 3 extremely dominant years ahead of him, potentially on a new contract, being hyper used in the offense instead of being overshadowed. He finally gets what he wants, and those narratives will do wonders for the dynasty trade market. The next guy we have on this list is Rome Odunze, and I know a lot of people would have him lower than me as well, simply based off the fact that he has been very inconsistent this season, had that great 3-game stretch to start the year, and since then, even though the Bears have been on an offensive heater and are trying to clinch the NFC top seed right now, he's been having a battle, whether it's through injury or Caleb Williams airmailing him the ball. I'm still not the biggest Caleb Williams fan. His footwork is quite messy, in my opinion, and I think his accuracy is lacking. I still think he has a lot to develop as a prospect here. So Rome has been creating separation at times and still actually has decent downfield metrics. However, Caleb has been unable to get him the ball in a consistent format, and it doesn't look like Ben Johnson really views him as the true alpha there with the way he does want to get Colston Loveland and Luther Burden involved in this offense. Those concerns are for sure valid. I just have to trust the fact that I was a massive Rome Odunze fan coming out of the University of Washington. I think his prospect profile is incredible. I think that he has all the upside in the world still to be a top 10 wide receiver in this league. And for that reason, I have to have him even above Ladd McConkey here because I just think his ceiling is higher. I think his ability to high point catches, to get contested catches, to be a red zone threat, the awareness he has on running routes and where the sticks are extremely important factors in how I view Rome Odunze moving forward. As we mentioned here, closing off tier 2, I have Ladd McConkey, who, yes, the Chargers have had a crowded room this year with guys like Gadsden breaking out, Keenan Allen having a resurgence, and, Quentin Johnston having a stretch there where he was being very fantasy relevant as well. Regardless, I just think there's a lot of mouths to feed on this Chargers offense. Jim Harbaugh definitely wants to run the football long-term here with Amarian Hampton and now Kamani Vidal being added to the picture. And I just think overall, Ladd McConkey has the upside to be a consistent wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 20 each season, but probably doesn't have the level of upside to ever go into that tier 1 of wide receiver that we're looking at here and be a guy that could give you a top 10 finish. For that reason alone, I think he's a very solid wide receiver 2 that'll probably give you consistent numbers, but never a guy that'll give you wide receiver 1 finishes. And he is one of those guys that does worry me, that Ladd could be one of the guys that ends up falling into tier 3 next season or in the coming years. And I don't think he's going to hold his value in Dynasty as well as others might think, simply just based off the profile of player he is. That's just my opinion. I would potentially be looking to move off of Ladd McConkey this offseason and sell him if someone's willing to give you fair value. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about here, kicking off tier 3, is Devonta Smith. As I mentioned before, I do think A.J. Brown vacates this offense this year, and I always felt like Devonta Smith had the upside to be a true alpha. He is an incredible route runner. He is obviously a great contested catcher. He is a good aerial threat. He obviously has the ability to get downfield and break big plays. I love Devonta Smith's potential future outlook with this Philadelphia Eagles team if he does get the chance to truly take over as an alpha in this system. And I think he could be a guy that potentially jumps to that tier 2, lower level here by this time next season. As we talk about entering tier 3, guys, I wanted to give you kind of my value ranges here. Obviously, tier 1 is going to be multiple first-round picks to acquire. Tier 2, I think you're still in the range of around 2 first-round picks to acquire for most of this top half here. I don't think anyone's given up George Pickens for anything less. I don't think a first gets it done unless it's a top 3 pick. Outside of that, Chris Olave, maybe you can get away with a first and a second-round pick for this bottom half of tier 2 here. But at this stage of tier 3, we're talking about guys that are probably worth at least a mid to late first-round pick. If it was determining between the 108 or 109 or Devonta Smith and I'm on a contending roster, I would probably be taking Devonta Smith there, just knowing what I know about Dynasty rookies and normally their inability to perform in the rookie season. Additionally, I've been burned plenty of times in the late first round with guys like Treylon Burks, that obviously we expected to have great level of upside, but truly anything after that 104 pick is normally quite a coin flip regardless. So diving into the next guy on this list is Jalen Waddle. And I do think Tyreek Hill is done in Miami. Obviously, they've got a ton of issues to sort out in that quarterback room as they decided to bench Tua Tagovailoa this week. And I do potentially believe that might be the last snap we see him take with this Miami Dolphins team. Now, his cap number and situation in Miami is absolutely terrible. They're going to eat almost $100 million in dead cap if they move on from him this offseason. So he might remain on the roster here. Regardless, I think that Miami team is in for a complete and utter overhaul. And with no Tyreek Hill being there for the future, I think Jalen Waddle is another one of those guys, like I was saying with Devonta Smith, that has the chance to jump tiers this next offseason and potentially be the bona fide one in Miami for the foreseeable future. The next guy we have on this list is Michael Pittman, and when we talk about consistency, guys, Michael Pittman was one of my biggest buys of last offseason after a value dip that he had coming off the broken back and the terrible Anthony Richardson performance we saw with him last year. I always knew he was going to be a candidate for a bounce back. I did not expect him to reach all the way up to wide receiver 6 for a sustained stretch this season. Now he's comfortably found himself again in the top 20 around wide receiver 17 today. All that being said, Michael Pittman is a guy that before the back injury last year had 3 top 20 seasons in a row, wide receiver 17, 13, and 14, I believe. Those finishes alone show you that he can give you sustained wide receiver 2 production as long as their situation in quarterback is healthy. That is invaluable on a dynasty roster, having the upside of a wide receiver 2 that you can rely on, that can give you wide receiver 1 finishes on any given week. That is a guy that I still would be willing to pay a late first-round pick for on a contending roster. Michael Pittman being 28 years old, and I do believe they're going to bring Daniel Jones back this offseason regardless of the Achilles injury, which was devastating for the man. Still gives me confidence in Michael Pittman moving forward as my wide receiver 2 on my dynasty roster. And for that reason alone, and the consistency he has displayed across the last 5 seasons, has me rank him above the next couple guys that you're going to see here. The next guy I do have is Jameson Williams, and I've had a love-hate relationship with Jameson Williams. I loved him coming out of college. Thought out of Alabama he had the chance to take over the NFL with his explosive speed and his ability to break plays downfield. Now, again, coming into a crowded Detroit Lions offense with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, and even a guy like Isaac Tesla this year that they traded up to get, shows you that Jameson Williams' ceiling could potentially be limited in his current landing spot. However, you were always one injury away from him being a true alpha. That being considered as well, he is currently sitting at wide receiver 12 after a several week run here after Dan Campbell took over the play calling mid-season. He has been getting far more involved and being used downfield in a more exciting capacity. For that reason alone, and based off the way I think that the Dynasty market is going to view Jameson Williams this offseason, I have him this high. Now, again, when I talk about these rankings, guys, I am still a little bit hesitant on bringing Jameson Williams into my team, and he's probably not a guy that I will be rostering in very many leagues, simply based off the inconsistency, the amount of mouths to feed in Detroit, and the way I view that offense moving forward. Now, all that being considered, guys, I do have to acknowledge simply that this is based off of where I think the market will value him. And I do think that there will be a lot of people and a lot of other creators this offseason that are going to tell you Jameson Williams has a path to be an alpha. He can be a consistent top 20 guy. We finally watched the breakout this year. And I think the narrative around him will be positive. Simply for that reason alone, I think he's a great guy to hold into the offseason if you're an owner to potentially explore a tier-up trade with. And when we talk about tier-up trades, obviously, speaks for itself, but this is a guy that you could add either a bench player, up-and-coming young, player, or a pick to, and move up into a different tier of wide receiver. And so my example here would be, could I take Jameson Williams and add a late first-round pick and potentially get my way up to a Garrett Wilson and get a third kicked back on that deal? I think it's very possible that those type of deals get done. Could you take a Jameson Williams and add another player potentially like a Jordan Addison, which we're going to talk about in a second, and see if you can get your way up to a Nico Collins if you are more of a contending roster and somebody else in your league is a rebuilder? I could see deals like that getting done. Same thing with Brian Thomas Jr. coming off of a down year. Same thing with Chris Olave, who still a lot of people have concussion concerns around. Okay? Now, let's move to the next guy on this list, T. Higgins. A guy who I think has been consistently overvalued in Dynasty, and I have a hell of a lot lower in my personal rankings than I believe a lot of other folks do. The reason for that is, guys, T. Higgins, I'm just going to give you the numbers here, has never had higher than a wide receiver 17 finish in his entire Dynasty NFL career. I know that sounds crazy, but it is true. And I think a large reason behind that is, one, competition with Jamar Chase, as we already know. Two, Joe Burrow's inability to stay healthy. And three, T. Higgins' inability to stay healthy. All those things together combine to be a guy that has a wide receiver 2 finish upside on any given season, as his best finish ever was when Cincinnati last year had statistically one of the worst defenses in NFL history. Joe Burrow was averaging over 40 dropbacks per game. Not numbers that are sustainable on a long-term offensive product. You're talking about a team that obviously eventually wants to get a more balanced approach where they can run the football, open their play action up a bit. Regardless, T. Higgins, his ceiling is capped. And entering his 27-year-old offseason here, he's a guy that is a prime sell candidate for me. We'll have more videos on this in the offseason of guys that I'm actively buying and guys that I'm actively selling. But T. Higgins is still remaining a sell candidate for me, as he was this last offseason and is today. Now, the next guy on this list is probably way lower than most people would have him as well, Marvin Harrison Jr. Simply put, I've not seen anything encouraging out of Marvin Harrison Jr. on an NFL level that makes me believe he can give you top 15 wide receiver finishes in the coming seasons. And sure, I'm not going to over hyperbolize and say he hasn't had a game or two where he's looked like he could be the prospect that everybody thought that he could be. However, we've yet to see even a sustained stretch of games where he's been able to do this on a weekly basis. Anybody can have a good game here and there. I want to see sustained production. I want to see 6 games continuously, a sample size, where he is commanding targets, where he is winning downfield, where he is finding the end zone. We have yet to see that stretch out of Marvin Harrison Jr. And with the unsure future ahead in Arizona with Kyler Murray probably vacating that locker room, them either deciding to roll long-term with Jacoby Brissett or potentially bring in a young prospect here or play the QB free agency rigmarole. I just don't love where Marvin Harrison Jr. is sitting today, and I don't see going into next season his prospect getting that much better. Seeing a situation where, yeah, he looks like he's absolutely going to be the guy now. I don't think that is on the cards for Marvin Harrison Jr. in the immediate. And personally, I just want out on this ride. I don't want to be stuck holding an asset, waiting for him to potentially break out. Obviously, the performances from Michael Wilson to finish this season have been incredible as well. He looks like a true alpha and breakout on that offense. Now, does Arizona decide to continue to roll with him as the one and look to him for the future? Was this a small sample size with Jacoby Brissett here, and we're seeing a Jerry Jeudy, Jameis Winston comparison where Michael Wilson is only good with Jacoby Brissett in certain circumstances where the Arizona Cardinals are playing from behind? I don't know. Genuinely, guys. I'm going to keep it completely real with you. I don't have any crystal ball to tell you what Arizona's going to do in this offseason. That all being considered, though, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a guy that has been on my sell list for the last 2 years. He is again on my sell list here. For the current value that he's at, I think he's going to take another hit this offseason, and just not a guy I feel great about having on my roster here. And I'm happy to be wrong. He could be a guy that, obviously has a far more productive, NFL career after age 25, but quite frankly, especially since I mostly have contending rosters, I just don't want to be on this train anymore. The next couple guys I have on these lists, as I'll try to speed it up here a little bit, is DK Metcalf, Jordan Addison, and Zay Flowers. These are 3 guys here that I think on any given week can give you a solid wide receiver 2 performance, but obviously come with the risk of giving you a far lower floor. The Ravens offense is always going to be a run-first offense, and Lamar Jackson having quite the dip in performance here in the middle of the season definitely doesn't provide me with a ton of stability for Zay Flowers' potential ceiling moving forward. Again, I view him as a guy that is going to be trapped in that 11 to 14 points per game range most of his career. Again, not a bad asset to have in a start 11 or deeper dynasty format, just not the type of guys that I normally like to roster. Jordan Addison is the exception out of this group of 3 here that I think has the ability to potentially still get to a tier 2 finish in his career. Now, when we talk about consistency, we are talking about a guy that in his first 2 seasons in the NFL finished wide receiver 21 and wide receiver 23. Extremely encouraging. That all being considered, we had Kirk Cousins, Sam Darnold, then J.J. McCarthy, a revolving door at quarterbacks. The inability for him to get consistency and chemistry with his quarterback, I think, is, obviously something that needs to be considered here. Former Blindekoff winner in Jordan Addison has all the upside in the world if somehow his potential situation were to change and he goes to a different team on his second contract, or the Minnesota Vikings end up getting more consistency in that quarterback room. I think Jordan Addison could absolutely be a tier jumper, and that's why when we talk about sells like Marvin Harrison Jr. this offseason, a buy this offseason for me is still Jordan Addison, as I believe if you're a rebuilding roster, I have absolutely no issue sending 2 second-round picks for Jordan Addison. I have no issue taking a guy, that might be up here, like a Jameson Williams, and getting Jordan Addison plus a pick back. And I think a trade that you might even be able to explore this offseason is if somebody has a late first-round pick, could you get Jordan Addison in a late first for Jameson Williams in an early second? Treat it like a pick swap here. Go up, get an extra first, accumulate more liquidity and value while tearing off a player in Jameson Williams, going down to a Jordan Addison who I think still has potentially long-term more dynasty upside than Jameson Williams does. Taking a quick breath here, guys. Thank you so much for following along on this video. I know this is going to be one of the longer ones as there is a ton of wide receivers to go over here. If you're still here, drop a comment. Let me know what you guys think so far of the rankings and what different players you would have ranked above some of my guys. Let me know if you have any questions on what you think some of these players' trade values are. I'll be happy to answer those in the comments. If you haven't already, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel. I greatly appreciate you guys. Let's finish off this tier strong and move into the next one. The final guys I have in this tier are simply the vets that I can't ignore based off production, but I do think are only fits for contending rosters in Davante Adams, Terry McLaurin, and Cortland Sutton. Davante Adams, I still expect to come back next year and have a great performance again with Matthew Stafford and this Rams team. It does not look like he's slowing down regardless of age. Currently wide receiver 6, obviously sustained a unfortunate hamstring injury just the other day and is probably going to miss this week of games, but regardless has been a out and out consistent fantasy performer for you for, a decade now. And I feel so good about having him on a contending roster. Terry McLaurin, a guy who obviously struggled through the injury and the contract negotiations this offseason, did take a hit to his dynasty value after a wide receiver 7 finish last year. Regardless, I do think that, when we talk about contract insulation, Terry McLaurin and Cortland Sutton both signing extensions this offseason, locking themselves up at least for the next 2 years in their current situation as the potential alphas, I think cannot be ignored here and are still going to give you top 20 finishes for the foreseeable future. Now let's dive into the next set of tiers here, guys. And I know this is going to get a little bit messy. I don't want you to get too attached to the order these guys are in, as I think there's a lot of fluctuation that could happen here. And I wouldn't fight you on having some certain guys over other guys. I think this is just more of a visual aid for you to see kind of what group I, put them in the similar players that I have around them. And obviously to kick off this tier is going to be some of the more young upside guys that I'm actively investing in Dynasty versus as we move on, we're probably going to talk more about veterans or even younger players that are still very, very, raw in their NFL career and that we've not been able to see sustained production out of. That all being considered, kicking off Tier 4 is one of my biggest buys of the offseason, which is going to be Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos. Now, when we did just talk about Cortland Sutton and getting a contract extension here, it was only a couple more years, and Troy Franklin being such a young prospect at only age 22 years old, having that previous chemistry in Oregon with Bo Nix, his quarterback, I think has the opportunity to, by age 24, be the alpha of that offense. We've seen flashes here where he's, currently a top 30 finisher and has given you great, red zone upside in this Denver offense, even during at times this season where, guys like Marvin Mims that a lot of people had hopes for has faded into oblivion. His usage is just completely inconsistent and not fantasy relevant. Pat Bryant might still have a tiny bit of upside in this offense, but Troy Franklin has emerged as the true wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 upside for the future there. I would be comfortably playing an early second for Troy Franklin at this point. In fact, if you guys are looking for a good example of how to execute a trade with Troy Franklin included, just before the trade deadline in one of my dynasty leagues this year, I ended up moving Davante Adams and a mid-27 second round pick in order to get Troy Franklin and a late 27 first round pick. And so again, I included a pick swap in there of a first to second, and I moved off the wide receiver 6, sending him to an ultimate contender, getting back Troy Franklin, who I think is going to provide me with more long-term upside and the ability to grow over the next couple of years in the dynasty market. These are the trades I love to do before the trade deadline if you don't feel like you're an immediate contender to start your retool. And if you do feel like you're an immediate contender, take your sure piece while actually including a small pick swap of like a late first to an early to mid second, which was what I was highlighting there. The next guy I have on this list is Wan'Dale Robinson, currently sitting at wide receiver 9. Playing very well, obviously, with Malik Neighbors injured there and Jackson Dart really starting to fly onto the scene. Now, the interesting thing with Wan'Dale Robinson is he is entering a contract year here, so there is no true insulation there that he is going to remain in New York. Now, I would expect the New York Giants to at least explore bringing him back here, as he's been a great outlet for Jackson Dart here, has shown his downfield ability, has shown his PPR upside, working out of the slot. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson was always a guy that I liked to consider as a more talented Khalil Shakir, ironically. He is a safety net guy for sure and has the ability to work out of the slot, but his route tree is far more developed than that. And he's actually quite a physical runner, even at his limited size with only being 5'9". He's actually been able to rack up a solid amount of yards after the catch. And I think Wan'Dale Robinson could be a sneaky buy for this offseason, as if he lands in an even better situation, he could get a nice dynasty value spike here. Or if he remains in New York, he seems to be a solid wide receiver too, alongside Malik Neighbors on an up-and-coming team with Jackson Dart leading the charge. And I expect that offense to take a nice step forward this next season. The next guy I have on this list, slightly above Luther Burden, is Jaden Higgins. Again, I always figured Jaden Higgins was a very polished prospect coming out of college. You know, he had the experience, the ability, and the route tree to translate to an NFL level. He obviously has the size and athletic profile to be a red zone threat. And I think Jaden Higgins is going to take a nice step forward next season with CJ Stroud continuing to ascend as a quarterback as well. The next guy I have on this list was a guy that I was not sold on at all coming out of college, but has been undeniably involved in this Bears offense in the recent weeks. And Luther Burden has shown actually quite solid advanced metrics down the field here. I think that he is going to get more involved in this Bears offense, as it does not seem like Ben Johnson wants to even include DJ Moore in the future plans of this team. It looks like it's going to be the Loveland, Burden, and Adunze show moving forward. I think Luther Burden is a candidate for a potential tier jumper next year into the tier 3 range. And as a gadget guy in this Ben Johnson offense, he's always going to provide you with a certain level of upside. The next guy I have here is a late riser this season in Michael Wilson that we alluded to earlier, giving you fantastic performances under Jacoby Brissett. In fact, since Jacoby Brissett took over and Marvin Harrison Jr. went out injured, Michael Wilson is actually the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy points per game. That's incredible. Now, again, when I talk about consistency, my main concern here is this a flash in the pan, or is this something that I can learn to rely on? I think time will tell with Michael Wilson if he's able to come out at the start of next season and even look half as dominant as he's looking now to give me wide receiver 2 consistent numbers. He's another great candidate for a tier jump, as he's only 25 years old and still has a lot of tread on the tires for his NFL career. The next guy I have here is Xavier Worthy, and I know a lot of people are probably going to fight me on this one and say Travis Hunter needs to be way higher up on this list. Personally, I haven't seen enough out of Travis Hunter yet, and I still don't know his, usage based off both sides of the ball potential and how he's going to be utilized as a corner, plus his sustainability in order to always be available and be on the field. The more he plays double snaps, the more candidate he is for a long-term injury, which we've already seen in his first season here. Not to mention, I still think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be a serious threat in that offense. Jacoby Myers has looked great at times this year. I know he's only on a 1-year deal there technically after the trade. Will they bring him back? Potentially. His chemistry looks great with Trevor Lawrence. They might explore that option. And if that happens, I think Travis Hunter could be in for a serious value dip. Even guys like Parker Washington have looked decent at times this season. Not to say he's a serious threat to Travis Hunter. I just haven't seen enough to put him any higher, guys. And I was not sold on him this last offseason at all. I don't own a single share of Travis Hunter across so many different leagues, including contract leagues. Therefore, I have him lower than Xavier Worthy. I still think Xavier Worthy, as Travis Kelce ages out in this Chiefs offense and they look to retool it a bit this offseason, does provide you with that deep downfield ability, blistering speed, and potential to ascend to be not, of course, a Tyreek Hill, but a Tyreek Hill style asset for Patrick Mahomes. He was also an extremely young prospect, we have to remember, guys. And at only 23 years old this offseason, Xavier Worthy still has 7+ years to develop in the league here. And it's a guy I don't mind stashing on my roster. A lot of guys have moved on from him. If you can send a mid-second round pick and a mid-third round pick to acquire Xavier Worthy and treat him as a stash on your roster, I absolutely love the idea of doing so. The next guy I have after Travis Hunter here is Jaden Reed, a guy who's kind of been forgotten based off injury and a crowded Packers pass catching room, but I still think has a lot of upside here. Now, of course, they did take Matthew Golden in the first round this last year, but clearly has not shown you really much of anything to get you excited that he could take over as the alpha there. I still think the true wide receiver 1 on this Packers team for the future is going to be Tucker Kraft, which is why I have even Jaden Reed as a potential wide receiver 1 this low on the list. Now, his route tree is intriguing, and, he has decent chemistry with Jordan Love. We've just, not seen a long-term sustainable product out of him yet, and I will be curious to see how he fits into this offense more with with a healthy Christian Watson and Tucker Kraft next season. For that reason alone, I think he's another good stash buy. If you can send a similar package as I suggested for Xavier Worthy for Jaden Reed, I'd be fine doing so. Now we're talking about guys that are more or less in that second round pick range of what I'd be willing to send in Khalil Shakir as, yeah, he's wide receiver 33 right now, but, he's never really shown you the level of upside to break the top 25, but he has always given you that consistent floor of like 9 to 12 points per game on average. Now, again, in deeper formats, that can be extremely valuable. I play in a lot of start 11 leagues where I go down all the way to playing guys like Tutu Atwell on bad bye weeks and injury-sustaining seasons, and a guy like Khalil Shakir could be a godsend on a team like that. All that being considered, if you play in a more shallow format, maybe like a start 9, you're probably never starting Khalil Shakir on a true contending roster unless it's just a 1 week bye week occurrence. That for that reason alone, I look at him more as roster depth, and for that reason, have him towards the end of tier 4 here as a guy that could give you upside on any given week, but doesn't really provide me with the league winning upside I'm looking for. Christian Watson is a guy that actually does have a lot of boom potential, but simply his injuries have been devastating in his career. Loved his college prospect profile, even though he came out a little older, I think at age 23. He has looked incredible at times this season and has looked dominant, showing you flashes of what I thought he could have been. The unfortunate thing here is just, as we mentioned, I look for consistency and sustainability in my players. Christian Watson has given me none of that with all the injury concerns, and, I think you just have to know what you're getting out of Christian Watson here. Jacoby Myers is one of the final guys to round out this tier here, where I had him a lot higher this last offseason. I was significantly underestimating how bad I thought Geno Smith's potential was. I thought that, coming off a decent couple seasons with Seattle, reuniting with Pete Carroll, getting Chip Kelly, some decent pieces in that offense like Bowers and Myers and Genty, I figured that his upside was a lot higher than it was. I actually expected him to be a top 17 wide receiver finish this year. He is now finally approaching that top 25 number again after having a great set of production in the games he's had in Jacksonville since the trade has occurred. That all being considered, though, he is a free agent this offseason, so there is a certain amount of risk that is baked into his profile here. Being only age 29, I think Jacoby Myers is one of those great contending pieces to have. So if you can buy him at value this offseason for a late second-round pick or a package of thirds, like I just watched him go for 2 third-round picks to a contender the other day before the deadline in one of my leagues, I think that that's a great price to pay for a guy that at only 29, probably going to sign a 2-year deal here somewhere and still give you contending production and could give you 2 top 25 finishes still. He's a talented player and has been consistent and available, which you like to see. Very little injury concerns with Jacoby Myers. The last guy in this tier here is Alec Pierce. And Alec Pierce has looked like a great downfield threat for this Indianapolis team this season. Gave them enough, encouragement to move off guys like Adonai Mitchell, when they made the Sauce Gardner trade. However, Alec Pierce is a free agent. Do I think he lands back in Indianapolis? I do not. I think he broadens his horizons and looks to take over a more legitimate role on a team. I think Alec Pierce has the upside to be a solid wide receiver too on a given roster. However, we obviously have to assume a certain level of risk entering free agency without a contract here and a potential landing spot. If he lands in a bad, spot, then that could obviously significantly plummet his trajectory from a dynasty asset perspective, but I still like the potential upside that Alec Pierce offers you. Now, the next tier, guys, is going to be guys that probably could be higher. And again, I wouldn't fight you if you wanted to move them into the tier 4 and some guys down. But this is simply based off of the risk that's baked into them, the, lack of knowledge we have about their future, and, where I value their potential production going to upon their return or, an injury, contract, all these things that are baked into these players. As I fill in all those filler words there, as I try to think where I'm going to go, you guys can see the gears turning in my mind. I do this all with no script, okay? This is all off the dome. So thanks for battling with me. I'm going to take one sip of water. We're going to dive into tier 5. Diving into tier 5 here, guys, we have Brandon Ayuk, a player who obviously has really, really plummeted down the dynasty rankings after having a fantastic season with the San Francisco 49ers just 2 years ago and signing a massive extension. Now he has, had massive injuries, misses the whole season, is unable to show up for his rehab, gets his contract voided, and I think is a prime candidate to get moved this offseason. Now, I do expect him to probably land with the Steelers, a team that was pursuing him before the contract negotiations even happened with San Francisco, but it is unsure of his landing spot as of now and the state of his ability to play football. If he hasn't been showing up correctly for rehab and there's those concerns there, then is he able to come back and be the player that we once thought he was? He's still young, and so he definitely still has the back half of his 20s here to continue to give you fantasy production in the right landing spot, and if he is truly healthy. But of course, there's a certain level of risk baked into him. The next guy I have is Josh Downs here, a player who I think a ton of people were massively inflating during the offseason here. In fact, not to call out too many folks, I got in an argument on Twitter early on this offseason with Matt Harmon from Yahoo Sports, who had Josh Downs ranked above Jackson Smith and Jigba on his wide receivers under age 25. Now, I responded saying, this is absurd. I think Jackson Smith and Jigba's ceiling is potentially wide receiver 1, and he said he strongly disagreed. Here we are a few months later, and Jackson Smith and Jigba is the wide receiver 1, and Josh Downs has fallen outside the top 40. But not to play the I told you so game too much here, just simply that Josh Downs, regardless of his prospect and his ability to create separation and some of the deeper analytics that have shown that he is actually quite a talented NFL player, he's just not been able to give you the level of fantasy production that we were looking for, coming out here. And simply based off of what we've seen today, I have, no true confidence in him increasing that output to be something massively sustainable. Now, could he jump into tier 4 next year and potentially maybe even the bottom of tier 3 if he's able to put up a top 25 finish? Yeah, of course. He's only 24 years old. There's definitely a ton of upside for him still. And I still like his skill level and his talent prospect profile. However, that being considered, when I talk about gauging most of these metrics off of consistency and how comfortable I feel putting them in my lineup, Josh Downs is not a guy that I can even start right now. The next two guys are obviously our vets here. Guys that have a lot of insecurity baked into them, but I still think have potential, to give you league-winning upside next year. Mike Evans being one of them. I do expect him to run it back in Tampa Bay here after another injury-riddled season. I would imagine he's going to want to go out on a 1,000-yard year like he typically puts up. Mike Evans is fantastic when he's on the field and doesn't look to me like he's lost too much of a step. Still has the ability to high point catches, be a very physical target, and his chemistry with Baker Mayfield is undeniable. The next guy is Tyreek Hill, who I potentially thought might hang it up after this season based off of some of the offseason antics that he gets up to on social media and just his kind of bipolar nature. I don't know if that's too aggressive to say. Seems to be all over the map these days. I would imagine he leaves Miami now after the Tua situation and just where we're looking moving forward. However, if he does decide to maybe reunite with Patrick Mahomes and go for a Super Bowl run or, try another swing with another team before he hangs him up here, he could be a guy that's decent to pick up in the offseason that could give you, a top 20 finish next year. Rashid Shaheed is the next guy on this list who obviously was traded to the Seattle Seahawks midseason this year. We haven't seen a ton of fantasy production from him in the wide receiver 2 position in Seattle. The important thing to remember about Seattle's offense, though, is even though Jackson Smith and Jigba is putting up incredible numbers, they are actually damn near at the very bottom of pass attempts in the league. I think they're 31st overall in passing attempts, and that should show you that Sam Darnold and Jackson Smith and Jigba are just being wildly efficient. Is the volume there to currently, sustain a relevant fantasy wide receiver 2 like Rashid Shaheed? No. I mean, you haven't seen that out of Cooper Kupp before his arrival, and you're not seeing it out of Rashid Shaheed since his arrival. Now, he has had a couple double-digit finishes here in the previous weeks, and I do expect that to potentially grow this offseason. Let's also remember he actually is a free agent this offseason as well, so there is no guarantee that Seattle is going to extend him. If they do end up extending him, I actually will be bumping him up these rankings quite a bit as he's still only 27 years old. And Clint Kubiak, the offensive coordinator in Seattle, had massive success with Shaheed in that early stretch of the season with Derek Carr, if you guys remember, just a year ago in New Orleans. And so I think with a full offseason here and prep with Sam Darnold, if they do decide to bring him back, he does become a serious downfield threat with Kubiak calling the plays. But we'll just have to see where that ends up. So he's another candidate as a decent buy option here that I actually don't mind stashing on deeper rosters and, has the potential to jump tiers next season. The next guy is DJ Moore, kind of the forgotten product of the Chicago offense. Now, he has done something in the last couple of weeks based off the injuries there, but just does not look like he's going to have long-term production here. And unfortunately, based off his contract, I don't think they're going to be able to cut him. So unless they find a good trade partner, DJ Moore is going to be locked in that Chicago room, just being too much of a inconsistent producer for you to rely on. Next guy we have is Stephon Diggs, who I actually had pretty high hopes for this season, but after a decent stretch that rose him up to wide receiver 15, he's fallen back out of the top 25 and has really struggled to make an impact on the field in previous weeks. Now, Drake May's upside alone probably keeps him here if they do decide to ride out his contract, which technically was a 2-year deal, but I think has void options in there from what I remember reviewing just the other day. So Stephon Diggs could be a free agent at the end of this year again. We'll see. And honestly, with all the off-field stuff going on with him as well, how much longer does he want to play football? He's a guy that probably isn't worth a whole lot in Dynasty. At this point, I don't think I'm even sending a second-round pick for him. We're talking about when we move to guys like DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs. These are guys that I think aren't even worth a second-round pick, personally for me. The next guy I have here is Matthew Golden. And again, Matthew Golden could probably be a lot higher on this list now that I look at everything here. But to be frank, I've just seen very, very little out of him so far. And in a Packers room that we had already talked about with Tucker Kraft being the true alpha, Jaden Reed having probably the most upside outside of that, Christian Watson being more of the downfield threat and still looking dominant at times, I just don't know if I ever see Matthew Golden being a guy that I'm going to consistently put in my fantasy lineup. And I know a lot of people out there will be like, you're too low on him. You're too low on him. He had first-round draft capital. Like, I would still pay a second-round pick for him, whatever. I wouldn't, guys. I wouldn't. I know it sounds crazy, but I play in a ton of leagues. And the guys that I'm able to purchase for second-round picks, I would just way prefer to have than Matthew Golden, especially on contending rosters. Like, on a contending roster, I consistently watch guys like Jacoby Myers plus, get moved. And I think, some people that really value picks in your league, which, depending on your league economy, every league economy is different. I play in leagues where you could easily go get a guy like Michael Wilson, Jaden Higgins, Wan'Dale Robinson for a second. I watched Wan'Dale Robinson move for a second-round pick just the other day. I could go a second and a third and get Troy Franklin. Why would I spend a second on Ricky Pearsall? And I think that's why when we jump into the next guy here, Ricky Pearsall has been my biggest sell guy for over a year now. Such an old prospect. He's already 25 years old. He's going to be 26. His birthday's in September. He's going to be 26 years old before the start of next season. He's yet to even give you a top 30 finish. And yeah, you can blame it on the injuries and the pew-pew and all this stuff, that happened to him. It doesn't matter. He's barely been on the field. He can't stay on the field, and the San Francisco offense doesn't even seem to be able to use him in a true capacity when he is on the field. And sure, you could point to a couple 2-3 game stretch where you're like, well, he was putting up wide receiver 1 numbers when he was healthy for a second. I ain't seen nearly enough out of Ricky Pearsall to have any sort of reason to buy him. If anyone will give you a second and a third for Ricky Pearsall in your league, which I think would still happen because just name value alone, I'd do it. Let me re-roll. If I can end up potentially with a Cam Skadaboo or a Jaden Higgins, style player in the second round of next year's draft, give it to me. Give it to me every day of the week. There's still gems in the second. We've got Quentin Johnston next, another guy who I just personally don't want any piece of on my roster. I would never feel good about starting him. He's more of a downfield threat, and I think the game script is really dependent for Quentin Johnston to succeed in defensive coverage. So not a guy I'm holding, and I actively sell as well. Chris Godwin's one of the guys I did want to highlight here as a potential buy candidate. He did sign that extension in Tampa Bay. He's obviously been battling back from the injuries most of this season and is finally starting to look like his old self again. I do think he'll benefit from an entire offseason with Baker Mayfield, Mike Evans, Jalen McMillan, Ibuka. Now, of course, it's a crowded room, but we know what Chris Godwin's potential role is there. They like to draw up those screen passes in the flat for him. They do like to use him out of the slot. Like, he definitely still has some upside here, and I think could be a sneaky contending buy piece for, a couple of third-round picks to throw Chris Godwin deep stash on your roster that you could be getting flex-worthy production out of next year. The final guy I have in this tier is Deebo Samuel, a guy who actually has probably given you way more production than I expected out of him this year going into Washington, but I think the Terry McLaurin injury has really helped inflate his value, and still not really a guy that I want a huge piece of on my roster. He seems to be like a dying asset to me, just a piece that is going to continuously lose dynasty value as we go on, and I don't like to buy any players that I think this time next season could be worth half of what they're worth today, and I think that's exactly what Deebo Samuel is. Now, Juwan Jennings is the next guy to kick off tier 6, and this is going to be the last tier that I greatly explore here with you guys, seeing that we're over an hour already on this video, and there's so many wide receivers to go over. Additionally, I just don't think that a lot of the guys underneath this have a ton of dynasty relevance outside of just being, roster stashes. And so this is going to be the last tier we go over. But I do have Juwan Jennings here, probably again, going to potentially explore free agency this offseason or, be brought back in San Francisco as a, flex player. Now, again, on a deeper roster, he's only 27 years old, so he still could provide you with flex-worthy upside, but I think the days of him ever being a consistent wide receiver 2 are beyond him in his career, and that's why I have him placed where I do. The next set of guys here, you could kind of like drag and drop around in any sort of order you want. I'm not going to fight you on it. I just think these are all guys that go in my bucket as young prospects with potential upside to be a potential wide receiver 2 someday in Dynasty, and that, stashing them on my roster or accumulating them for, third round picks or other roster stashes or selling veterans, if you're more in a rebuilding stage. Could I move a Ramondre Stevenson, to a contending roster who has Travion Henderson and get Torrey Horton back? I love doing deals like that, right? Could I move a J.K. Dobbins to get a Jalen McMillan in a third, something like that, right, guys? Like, these are the type of trades that I'm looking to get these guys in this tier. But Torrey Horton, a lot of upside, coming out of Colorado State this last year, only fell outside the top 100 picks, in my opinion, simply because of the injury that he sustained at the end of his college career here, and that's why he fell down the board a bit. If you go back and watch his college tape, he was putting Travis Hunter, in a spin cycle multiple times this season. So, I think Torrey Horton still has a lot of upside, and you saw flashes out of it this year. Before he went to the IR, he caught 2 touchdown passes in a game from Sam Darnold and was looking like he was breaking downfield threat. Absolutely. So, do they bring Rashid Shaheed back? Maybe. If they don't, is Torrey Horton going to be their long-term depth or deep threat guy? You don't really know exactly, but I like the upside Torrey Horton has here. Next guy, Jalen McMillan, another University of Washington product out of that national championship run they had a couple years ago with Michael Penix. Obviously was a top 100 draft pick, looked really good for Tampa Bay in his rookie season, sustained the neck injury during training camp this year, which put him out for a while. Extremely unfortunate occurrence, but Jalen McMillan, still a lot of upside, obviously in a crowded offense to some degree here, which is why he is placed where he is, but he's a great stash that I love. I think that he's got potential upside for the Dynasty future. Isaac TeSlaa, rinse and repeat with Jalen McMillan, had the draft capital. Detroit really liked him. He's shown a lot of upside here, but also in a very crowded offense, so, potentially limited upside unless there's a bunch of injuries that happen in front of him. Trey Tucker actually looks like a bright spot here in this Raiders offense this season that has struggled a lot, but, he kind of reminds me of a just these after the catch threats that can get stuff done in the open field and has some speed behind him. So Trey Tucker could be a flex worthy guy for the future. Trey Harris we've seen very little of, but obviously had the draft capital, and I always trust these Ohio State prospects to be solid. Sorry, not Ohio State, Ole Miss prospects to be solid. Like AJ Brown and DK Metcalf have been for us coming out in recent years. But I do think Trey Harris, still solid prospect out of college, seemed pretty polished to me as a little bit of an older guy who had the experience. The Chargers offense has had a lot of mouths to feed this year, but he still could have potential, wide receiver 2 upside in the future. The next guy here is probably a guy that actually I think is the biggest candidate to jump tiers and could be, a guy that ends up in tier 4 or tier 3 next year in Chimere DK. He's actually looked like a serious bright spot on this Titans offense, and Cam Ward seems to have already built a decent rapport and trust him. I love, what I've seen out of Cam Ward in recent weeks here, and on such a terrible team, and that's probably going to go over an entire overhaul again this offseason. I think DK, offers a lot of upside. You've seen him obviously get a lot of good stuff done in the special team side of the house as well. And so for that reason alone, I think he's a good product to invest in. The next guy I have is Adonai Mitchell. Some people love him, some people hate him. I'm probably somewhere closer to the hate side, but, I do think that he still has some upside and has shown you flashes here at the New York Jets, but I still think his hands are questionable. I think he's mostly a downfield threat, and, I just don't see a lot of consistency in his game right now, not to mention with his current landing spot and how much work the Jets have to do and what his contract situation is going to look like far beyond this year. Does make me just view him as a really deep stash, not a guy I'm able to put in my roster with any sort of confidence. Luke McCaffrey is the next guy on this list, a guy who, actually showed you some flashes this year at times in Washington before the injury. Unfortunate, but, looking at that wide receiver room with simply guys like Terry McLaurin there, obviously, and then, an aging out Debo, there is opportunity for Luke McCaffrey to rise up and potentially, be a fantasy relevant player in coming years. And so that's why I thought this was a nice step forward year for Luke McCaffrey, but still nothing crazy. This next guy, I don't know why his picture is in a Denver Broncos uniform. It's Kyle Williams for the New England Patriots. Rookie out of Washington State last year. He was a guy I was very, very high on. And to be completely frank, if I was doing my super biased thing here, I'd be dragging him all the way up into this tier, probably somewhere above Stephon Diggs for the future. But I can't in good conscience do that to you guys. With how little we've seen of him in the NFL this year. Now, prospect profile alone, I have Kyle Williams far ahead. Like I said, I think he still has a ton of upside, and the Patriots wide receiver room is still pretty wide open entering this offseason. If they don't bring Diggs back, you've seen a little bit of Boutte this season, but nothing crazy. Kyle Williams still could be a potential future alpha, and so he's a guy I like that, some people might have just bought into the hype train this offseason, expected the world from him. He gave him nothing. If they're willing to just sell him for a lowly pick, by all means, I'd gladly take him. I'd take him for the next guy on this list, Keon Coleman. I think a lot of people had really lofty expectations for Keon Coleman, but it's clear that he's just not going to be the alpha in that Buffalo system, something that they're going to absolutely have to address this offseason. And beyond that, being a healthy scratch multiple times this year, I hope you were one of the people that took him after the first week and flipped him. I included him in a deal with Cam Ward and a second-round pick in order to tier up and get Joe Burrow the week of Joe Burrow's injury when someone was super down on him, and Keon Coleman had 2 solid fantasy weeks to start the season. It felt great, but that's why you got to be a hyperactive trader and make deals happen as soon as these guys take value spikes, like we saw with Keon Coleman. But again, not a guy that I really think has a ton of upside in the immediate future. The next few guys here are, again, a lot of nothing, but Darius Slayton is on contract with the New York Giants for the next couple of years. He signed that 3-year extension just a year ago, and they gave him decent money, so he's probably just going to be one of those guys that, during injuries, during bye weeks, during whatever, you can kind of rely on him as a flex play, upside option guy. He's not a bad player, but he's nothing to write home about. Jack Besh is another guy who we've seen very little of this season. I think a big product of just how bad the Raiders have been in general. Don't think I can really give you a clear-cut answer on whether or not he has fantasy relevance at an NFL level until we see more out of this Raiders team and whatever happens to them this year. The next guy I have is Isaiah Bond. Again, more of a product of his environment than anything. The Cleveland offense has not looked great, and they've changed quarterbacks 3 times this year. But Isaiah Bond coming out of Texas, I thought was a better prospect, than Matthew Golden was. And obviously the legal trouble with him, held him down, but extremely young. If this Browns team does figure it out a bit, you might see some upside from him. And the final guy here is Kayshon Boutte. Again, don't get too attached to this order, guys. These are just guys in the same grouping here that I think are similar value of what you would trade for him. And Kayshon Boutte, he's actually looked pretty encouraging for New England and probably been one of their best producers this year, even though the ball gets spread around left and right on that offense. And I don't feel like there's any alpha. All that being said, guys, we are going to finally close out the video. Thank you so much if you made it the whole hour and 10 minutes here. Please make sure to drop a like, a comment, and subscribe. Let me know any questions you guys might have. Don't forget to join the Discord that is linked in the bio here. Would love to see you guys in there as we talk Dynasty strategy all offseason long. Really appreciate all the support we've been getting on these videos, guys. If you have any comments, critiques, and other things you want to see me do, please go ahead and let me know. I am cranking a video a day right now, trying to get as much content out there for you guys so that we can approach this offseason with a winning strategy. Again, thank you guys so much for your support. Final few things. Join the Discord. If you feel like supporting me on Patreon, I would greatly appreciate it. Head over to my website, which will also be linked in the bio and the description here, dynastypricecheck.com, just my username with a .com. Go to the Community Hub page, sign up for a Patreon. That gives you access to a monthly strategy session with me to break down as many Dynasty rosters as you want and build a long-term plan. You get access to some of the lock channels on the Discord, like the DPC hotline, where I can help you with your start sits every single week, respond to trade offers for you, really help keep your team up to date with everything going on, and you get access to my market movers, so you see all the trades that I make in every single one of my leagues and the guys that I'm buying before they hit these YouTube videos, TikTok videos, all that good stuff. Additionally, if you're like, I don't want to do Patreon or whatever, or you feel like inclined to donate at all, you can go to my website, click the Buy Me a Coffee in the top right corner, and we are in partnership with the radio show this year on San Diego Sports 760 that we have every Wednesday with the San Diego Food Bank to donate meals to families in need. So know that the proceeds to that will go to help package some meals for some families in need. Additionally, with anything else you purchase on the website, like a Dynasty Detox, which is a full roster breakdown with a 3-year Dynasty plan, by yours truly in a consultation session where you're going to talk with me one-on-one. Again, also in partnership with the San Diego Food Bank, we will be donating some meals on your behalf. Thank you guys so much for everything. I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.